We'll be live in.
And I start speaking right after?
No, Rich will introduce you.
Yeah.
I'm going to introduce him. Welcome, everyone. As we begin the next session titled Pharma Perspective on Moving the Value Chain to a More Centric Pharma, I'd like to invite Rich Campbell, our Vice President of Global Clinical Trial Planning and Alliance Management at Bristol Myers Squibb, to provide some opening remarks and introduce our keynote speaker. Rich?
Great. Thanks so much, Kathy. So good afternoon and good evening, everyone. As Kathy said, my name is Rich Campbell. I head up Global Clinical Trial Planning and Alliance Management here at Bristol Myers Squibb. So my role ensures that we are effectively planning our trials, that we have strong partnerships with our vendors and external partners, that we manage and grow our operational capabilities, and that we're really prioritizing engaging patients and sites in our trials. So I'm really thrilled that we're able to host this summit again this year in partnership with Panagora, despite all the challenges that the pandemic is throwing at us. So let's be optimistic for an in-person version in 2021. So I hope you're enjoying the agenda today and that you've already started to identify some real tangible opportunities to enhance the patient experience in your own role. At BMS, we're constantly exploring ways to improve the experience of patients in our trials, from measuring and minimizing patient burden in our protocols to embedding patient voice in trial designs and providing an easy-to-use patient portal. We're always looking for ways to make it easier for patients to find and participate in trials. Now, in order to effectively prioritize these approaches and focus areas, it's really important to have leadership that is truly committed to the patient experience. And with that in mind, I'm really pleased to introduce our next speaker, Samit Hirawat. He's BMS's Executive Vice President, Chief Medical Officer, and Head of Global Drug Development. Samit came to us in 2019 to BMS and quickly focused his efforts on enhancing the patient experience. By lending his support to internal efforts like our diversity in clinical trials and our patient expert engagement resource, he's really been an active driver and champion in our efforts in this space. So he'll be speaking on the pharma perspective on including the patient experience in drug development today. So please welcome Samit Hirawat.
Well, thank you, Rich, and it's a pleasure to be here amongst you, and certainly happy to share just a few thoughts that I have and looking forward to hearing from you as well. So good afternoon, everyone, and I hope that you're keeping safe, you're healthy, and it's very unfortunate that we can't be together in person, which would have been, of course, a much better way to communicate. But we do live through the challenges. We do have the challenge of pandemic right now. And being an eternal optimist, I'm looking forward to the time when we can do so in the future and be together and see each other face to face. Rich has already introduced myself. I'm a physician by training. I'm the Chief Medical Officer here at BMS. I joined about 14 months ago, but I've been in the industry for about 20 years doing drug development across oncology as well as non-oncology indications. So certainly have a lot of passion in terms of bringing transformational treatment options for many serious diseases that unfortunately many of the people in the world are afflicted with, and certainly want to see that changing over time. I'm excited to be here at the Panagora Patient Experience Summit and to be able to share my perspective on patient centricity and how we can work together to bring the patient voice into our efforts to discover, develop, and deliver medicines to the patients. I personally have a big passion for patient voice in clinical development, and this is not new. This comes on right from the days that I went to med school and I considered research as I was writing my first protocol. I was always concerned, what burden will I be putting on the patient as I conduct a clinical trial? What data do we really need in terms of collecting in the study? How many samples will we collect? And am I measuring the right endpoints as I think about the disease and look forward to experimenting a new treatment option or new ways of delivering the medicines to patients? And in a pursuit of our vision to really transform patients' lives through science, which is the vision for BMS and for us in development, we believe that it is critical to seek insights from the people who are truly impacted by the diseases that we are trying to research and find new ways of treating. And weaving the patient perspective into the development side of things and commercialization of medicines, it has become increasingly important, and not just for BMS, but probably throughout the whole healthcare industry and beyond even. So we have to understand the impact that our studies have on the lives of the patients and the overall healthcare infrastructure. As we look to our inclusion-exclusion criteria as the endpoints that we measure on the schedule of events, which define how often the patient has to come to see the doctor, how often we measure the endpoints, how often we take blood samples. In order to be able to do a good clinical trial designs, we have to pay more attention to each and every aspect of that. If you think about any given clinical trial, the basic infrastructure of a clinical trial is to define what are the types of patients we want to enroll in a clinical trial. Now, if we really want to enroll a clinical trial from a broader perspective, broader population perspective, and have the applicability of the future potential benefit of the medicine for a larger population, then we can't restrict the inclusion-exclusion criteria, whether it be based on lab parameters or it be based on the subsequent or concomitant medications or other prior diseases. And I'm always struck by the number of inclusion criteria in a protocol, which usually are around 13 or 14. But then when I look at the exclusion criteria, it always is 20 plus. And I'm always struck by that. I always question that, and it has garnered a lot of discussion throughout my past 20 years at every protocol development as to why we do it and how we can actually do better in terms of defining those. I can share a bit more about how we're thinking about things over here at BMS and working to ensure that the patient voice, it is represented in our overall research and development and commercialization plans at BMS. We spend time working closely with expert patient advocates to define and implement a new process, I think Rich mentioned it, that spans all markets and therapeutic areas. And the process is called Patient Expert Engagement Resource, or what we call PEER, very aptly named because we do believe that patients are our peers and they're not somebody that we go seek out in a special way, but rather they're a partner in drug development as we think about treating many of the diseases. And this peer initiative, it ensures that the patient perspective is heard and considered at every step of drug development, whether it be through discovery, during the early phases of development, late phase of development process, and through to the commercialization aspect. One of the first times this kind of all-encompassing approach has been implemented, I would say, probably throughout the biopharmaceutical industry, or at least at BMS, I'm sure, we are changing the way we are looking at drug development. And I truly am incredibly proud to have been a part of the development of this program and this process as we look forward to taking it into all therapeutic areas. And a major action, which we've already implemented to a certain extent, we want to continue to implement in a broader way, is through the requirement that the peer process is applied to all pivotal trial protocols already, which we are now requiring the teams to include expert patient advocate engagement prior to the final sign-off of these protocols. And this process can start very early on as we decipher and we create a protocol concept sheet so that we can gain an understanding from the patient community as to what is important and where the burden of the trial might actually outweigh the benefit that we may ultimately see in the study. In addition, the challenges of COVID-19 have opened up opportunities for those of us in the industry to hear from patients on the adaptation made to clinical trial conduct. It is not a hidden secret that as the pandemic began and it started to impact overall healthcare industry and beyond, in March, there was a lot of burden imposed on the healthcare system, on patients, on investigators, and all other healthcare systems that were involved in the clinical research process. And everybody had to take a pause and redefine how we think about clinical research. For example, the way we pivoted during the COVID-19 pandemic start off, it increased the role of telemedicine. And patients participating in trials are conducting some of the trial visits virtually. And now we've heard feedback from patients and investigators. The choice to have some virtual visits could remove potentially barriers to clinical trial participation. And we're now thinking how to consider that during the clinical trial design. Now, it doesn't come without its own consequences and the limitations. Just recently, we were talking to some of the patient advocates who said, telemedicine is great, and we would love to see it utilized more and more and more. But there is value for once in a while for the patient to be seen in person by the physician as well, because if you think about the body language through which a physician or the nurse can gain more information, the uneasiness of that sharing of personal perspective of a patient when you're on the telephone versus when you're in person, that can be further evaluated if you are seeing them in a personal way. And so all of those things have to be incorporated. All of those things have to be learned from. And we cannot think about it just sitting in the offices as we write the protocol. We have to reach out to patient advocates who can give us that perspective so that we can learn and we move forward. These are just a couple of things that we think about in terms of the ways that industry can partner with patients, with caregivers, and with advocates from a patient perspective. And of course, we welcome your thoughts on how we can do this more, how we can do this better, and how we can apply it to a broader perspective and wider ways of thinking. By hearing insights from patients and expert patient advocates, we can identify the barriers to participate in clinical trials, pull in the learnings to accelerate the development of future medicines, and ultimately use these insights in conversations when we go to the regulatory agencies, when we think about health authorities across therapeutic areas, and not just apply it to oncology or to immunology, etc. If you think about diversity in clinical trials, if we don't hear from the patient community what the reasons might be for limited enrollment of underserved communities, underrepresented communities, we will never learn. So we want to apply those principles, we want to apply those learnings so that we can encourage a larger population to be represented in our clinical trials from an ethnicity perspective as well. We have our commitment to seek your input as we develop our plans for the medicines in our pipeline. I really look forward to hearing your thoughts, not just today, but in the future as well. And I do want to take a moment to thank you, and thank you again for your time today as we transition into a Q&A session. I think we have a few minutes, so we have the possibility of taking a couple of questions over here. Rich, I guess I give it back to you.
Actually, Samit, I can take on from here as far as any questions. I'm checking the chat. Are there any questions? If you do have questions, please do post them in the chat. We'll give it a second. I didn't see any questions. I saw a lot of comments coming through. So Samit, I think maybe a question that we're thinking is, with what we're doing at BMS so far with PEER and some of the other initiatives, is there an example of kind of the impact that we've already seen from that?
Well, I don't have an example from the BMS experience yet, and maybe Rich, you might be able to speak to that at this time. But the thing that we have done is, as we are going through the protocol development process, and again, the teams may know it better. Unfortunately, I'm not involved in the day-to-day practice of this. So I will probably be the last person to see a larger impact, but I'm sure the teams are seeing smaller impacts. What I do know from my past life is when I was involved in the day-to-day activities, when you include these perspectives and reach out to the patient community, you realize how important it becomes to measure the right effects. For example, inclusion of pain scale measurement in a breast cancer trial it sort of dawned on us quite late in the development of therapies that it is not just because of the bone metastatic disease that patients with breast cancer feel pain. There are many other aspects of it. And when you start to measure it, then you learn whether the treatment that you're testing is leading to an improvement or keeping it at least the same and not making it worse. And we saw both aspects. There are things that can flare up that pain, and there are things that actually improve the pain in addition to improving the outcome for the disease. So it's important to learn those finer aspects of even what the patients are experiencing prior to treatment, during treatment, after treatment is withdrawn because of progression of disease, for example, in oncology. Rich, I don't know if you want to expand on that.
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, one of the biggest successes has been not necessarily a mind shift from we never thought of it to now it's really important, but really taking something that everyone knew was important and giving it a very structured framework to ensure that it's, you know, really specifically considered throughout the process. And it's really only by bringing in those kinds of voices that we can step back and really understand, you know, even just what we would think of as kind of operational or logistic, like how much burden does it put on a patient if you structure visits a certain way, or if you can do just small things to make a difference to make the participating in that trial easier.
Great, thank you. And we do have a couple questions in the chat. What do you see as the biggest obstacle to achieving these important goals?
I think Rich already mentioned one of them. While it may not be the only thing, but having the change in mindset and just to be able to have that dialogue, to be able to open ourselves up for a little bit from a time perspective, energy perspective, and applying that, who these patients are. It could be us at some point in life, in the future as well, and what would be important to us. So just that, even the little bit of the change in mindset, and to be able to have the courage to reach out, that somebody else may have a perspective that I'm not seeing, and that could be the right perspective. Just having that ability and that openness in itself is a big step, and I'm looking forward to continuing the learning that we have just initiated.
Great, thanks. And one final question: has leadership had to do anything to change the mindset of the researchers to value the patient input? This is where some companies have had challenges.
I obviously don't want to be the one to say that leadership should take the benefit of bringing this novelty. It certainly is not. It is already there in the minds of the people. What leadership can do is provide that support, that I am interested in it too, and that I am passionate about it, and to just nudge it so that it just crosses that threshold, that it becomes important for everyone else. Leadership can only provide support. I'm never a believer of top-down driving of initiatives or doing things, but rather I would like to listen to what ideas people have and how I can give my voice if it can go further and if it can become beneficial for the larger community. Rich, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think that it's almost a tops down and bottoms up approach that I think has been successful so far. So leadership definitely being clear and direct around the importance and that this is something to prioritize, and then also kind of out a little bit outside of the research team itself, making sure that all of the tools are there and the framework is there to allow them to bring it into the process in the easiest way, right? So that the mind has shifted a little bit, that this is a much higher level of importance, and that we have the tools to do it really effectively.
Great. So I see there are a couple more questions I don't know that we're going to have time to get to, but I appreciate everybody's feedback, engagement in this, and I want to thank Samit for sharing some of the great work that BMS is doing in bringing the voice of the patient to our clinical trials, as well as the steps that we've taken to address patient needs during these unprecedented times of COVID and our diversity principles and priorities as well. So very much appreciated, and thank you both for joining the session. We'll be moving into our next session, which will be a panel discussion on diversity in clinical trials. So look forward to seeing everybody there.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Kathy. And I saw the chat comments, and I agree that lots of good stuff there, which certainly we should capture, and we'll obviously then take care of trying to get answers to those as well. Thank you.
Certainly will. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.